"Chris, why are you home?" Angela, my wife of 28 years, asked as she stepped in through the garage door, catching sight of me sitting at the kitchen table no more than 10 feet away. Her voice carried a hint of surprise, but her presence brought something even more intriguing. A tall, younger man shadowing her entrance, partially obscured by her figure. Angela, always captivating, stands an impressive 5 feet 9 inches, with a fit, balanced frame of 145 pounds. Her auburn hair, soft and glossy, cascaded over her shoulders, framing her striking features. Dressed in her usual professional attire, she wore a crisp white blouse, the top button undone to reveal a tantalizing glimpse of cleavage, accentuating her stunning 38D chest. A tailored black linen skirt hugged her curves, emphasizing her world-class legs, while 3-inch heels added a graceful lift, enhancing the natural curve of her backside. I briefly pondered her seemingly absurd question. Why was I home? Well, I lived there, didn't I? Letting the thought simmer for a moment, I finally replied, I live here. My tone, though measured, couldn't quite hide the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. A frustration that had been growing steadily over the past few weeks. For years, I had loved to tell anyone willing to listen about how Angela and I first met. She was working as an administrative assistant for 4 top executives at her company. On the day we met, she escorted me to the senior suite for what turned into hours of meetings. As she walked me back to the lobby afterward, I decided to take a leap and asked her out to dinner. That dinner became the foundation of everything, our history, our life together. But here we were now, and things felt different. By this point, Angela's companion had moved to stand beside her. I expected some kind of smug expression, but to my surprise, I saw concern in his sharp, intelligent eyes. Clearly, things weren't unfolding the way he had anticipated. I turned my attention back to Angela, curiosity overtaking the irritation. "What brings you home early?" I asked, noting the unusual timing. She was a full hour and a half ahead of schedule. Angela and I had been inseparable since that first date, building a life together with unwavering commitment. I poured my heart and soul into her and our family, while also creating a thriving insurance brokerage firm. With her company's support, Angela had earned her bachelor's degree over 6 years, working her way up from an administrative role to leading the HR department in their Hartford, Connecticut office. For nearly 3 decades, I had loved Angela unconditionally, even as I began to notice subtle but undeniable changes in her. Determined to stay calm, I masked my emotions with my signature crooked grin, a habit she knew well. "So, why are you really here?" I asked, tilting my head slightly for emphasis. Angela's expression shifted, a mix of determination and discomfort crossing her face. "We came home early to talk with you," she said carefully. The word "we" stood out, and I honed in on it immediately. "We?" I repeated, locking eyes with her. Before she could respond, the man at her side stepped forward, extending a hand in introduction. "I'm Michael Browner," he said confidently, "the new attorney at Kellerman & Sons. I've been working closely with Angela for the past few months." I ignored his outstretched hand, refusing to break eye contact with Angela. My jaw tightened as I held back the urge to lash out. Instead, I let a low growl escape, my voice sharp with restrained fury. "I know exactly who and what you are," I said, my words cutting through the tension like a blade. For the first time, I saw a flicker of unease cross Angela's face. Michael, too, looked unsettled, his confidence momentarily faltering. Whatever plan they had concocted, it was clear that things weren't going according to script. "My wife," I began, my voice laced with deliberate emphasis. "You once warned me about the severe consequences anyone would face for crossing you. So tell me, why are you tolerating such blatant disrespect in your own home from this individual?" I gestured pointedly in his direction, refusing to sugarcoat my words. Let's just say I wasn't in the mood for diplomacy. Angie, ever the meticulous planner, looked visibly unsettled. Her expression betrayed a mix of worry and confusion, emotions she typically kept hidden behind a composed facade. I knew her well enough to guess she and this mofo, as I'd already started calling him in my mind, had mapped out every conceivable twist this conversation might take. To her, I must have seemed like the compliant, defeated husband she'd carefully prepared for. But oh, how wrong she was. I risked a quick glance at Mofo. The corner of my mouth twitched into a smile as I imagined his discomfort. I'd bet good money his muscles were clenching tighter than mine, though I wasn't exactly feeling relaxed myself. A storm was brewing, one far more chaotic than anything Angie and her companion could have anticipated. Taking a few slow, deliberate breaths, I tried to tamp down the seething anger threatening to overtake me. No good would come of letting my emotions spiral out of control. Not yet, anyway. Instead, I decided to take the wheel and steer this exchange off the rails of whatever script they'd rehearsed. How about we make some drinks and move this to the living room? I suggested, keeping my tone deceptively casual. Angie hesitated but eventually asked for a glass of wine. When I turned to Mofo, he looked wary, as though bracing for a trap. Angela mentioned you enjoy bourbon and craft beer, he offered cautiously. I nodded, acknowledging the comment without much reaction. Rising from my seat at the kitchen table, I made my way to the family room bar, leaving the pair behind. The moment I stepped out of earshot, their whispering began. A frantic, urgent exchange that only confirmed my suspicions. After a few minutes, I joined them in the living room. They'd chosen to sit together on the sofa, a choice that didn't escape my notice. Handing Angie her favorite Merlot and Mofo a tulip glass of amber ale, I settled into the armchair across from them. Raising my glass, I offered a toast. Cheers, I said, taking a slow sip of the fiery bourbon. Mofo mirrored the gesture, bringing the glass to his lips. Studying the ale's color and carbonation like a connoisseur, he couldn't resist making a comment. This is a pretty complex beer, he remarked. What's it called? Pabst Blue Ribbon, I replied with a straight face. The reaction was instant. Mofo's eyes flared with something between irritation and disbelief, while Angie looked downright puzzled. Pabst Blue Ribbon? She echoed, her voice tinged with confusion. Didn't you once say it was worse than donkey urine and the worst beer ever made? She didn't get to finish her thought because I burst into laughter, unable to hold it back any longer. Her confusion quickly turned to frustration. Chris, this isn't funny, she snapped. You're being rude and condescending, and this was supposed to be a calm, productive conversation. Still smiling, I leaned forward slightly. Rude? Condescending? Come on, Angie, I'm just trying to kickstart the conversation properly, I replied. My tone is light as if we were discussing the weather. After all, who better to teach me about polite, uplifting and loving discussions than my own wife? Angie winced, her gaze dropping to the floor as though she could avoid the weight of my words. Mofo, on the other hand, decided to take charge. Clearing his throat, he began to speak, his tone measured and deliberate. But before he could gain too much ground, I held up a hand to interrupt, my eyes locking onto his. Before we go any further, I said, fixing him with a sharp stare, let's talk about how you started this little introduction of yours with Mr. Harrington. Presumptuously, he switched from addressing me as Mr. Harrington to casually calling me Chris. I wasn't having it. Leaning forward slightly, I insisted he refer to me as Mr. Harrington from now on. As his face flushed with unease, I shrugged nonchalantly and offered him a second option. Or you can call me sir, I added with a pointed look. Not giving him the chance to continue, I turned my attention back to Angela, my tone now carrying an unmistakable edge. So, what exactly is it you wanted to discuss? I asked, my gaze fixed on her. When Michael appeared ready to chime in, I cut him off mid-breath. I was speaking to my wife, I said coldly. You can sit there, sip your complex amber ale and keep quiet. Angela's reaction was immediate and fiery, clearly frustrated. She accused me of being out of line and insisted that my behavior needed to stop. I nodded as though I were taking her words to heart, pausing for effect before responding. Tell me, Angie, I said calmly. Would you say my behavior is worse or better than yours over the past few weeks? Her expression shifted, confusion mixed with a flicker of worry. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Michael seemed to freeze in place, as though holding his breath, no doubt sensing their carefully rehearsed plan unraveling. I locked eyes with her, my voice low but steady. "I'll tell you what I mean," I began, the weight of my words slicing through the tension in the room. "I can't decide what bothers me more. The fact that you're involved with someone else or the fact that you've been treating me like an idiot." Angela's jaw dropped slightly, her astonishment evident. Her expression hardened quickly, though, and her eyes narrowed. In a hushed tone, she shot back, "I've got more friends at your office than you do, Chris. 2 weeks ago, I received an anonymous email. It warned me about your alleged affair." Her voice wavered as she continued. "There were 3 attachments. Photos of you at Middlewoods Park, having a picnic, holding hands, and even kissing someone." She hesitated, then softened her tone slightly. "I'm sorry you're finding out this way," she added, as though trying to regain control of the conversation. "I've been trying to figure out how to address it." Before she could go any further, I interrupted, my words cutting straight to the point. "Do you want a divorce?" I asked. Her reaction surprised me. "No!" she exclaimed, her voice filled with urgency. She leaned forward on the couch, resting her elbows on her knees, and spoke passionately. "Chris, I love you. I do. But—" Her words hung in the air for a moment before she finally continued. "My involvement with Michael wasn't serious. It was a brief fling, nothing more. He's new to Connecticut, hasn't made many friends yet, and I thought he'd move on soon enough, find someone else once he settled in." Her voice faltered, but she pressed on. "I know it was wrong. It didn't work for me either. I signed up for a monogamous marriage with a loving husband. Not this." She gestured vaguely, as though trying to encompass the entire situation. Angela's tone turned apologetic. "I'm sorry, Chris. Truly, I am. But maybe a divorce would be better. It might align more with the future we both deserve." But then, almost in the same breath, she shifted again. "But I don't want that," she pleaded. "I don't want a divorce, and I don't think you do either." Her voice cracked slightly as she tried to explain herself. "What happened with Michael? It was a one-time mistake. It was nothing more than a moment of attraction, a stupid need for some excitement. It's not who I am. It's never happened before, and I promise you, it will never happen again." I watched her closely, taking in every word. Picking up my bourbon, I swirled the glass absent-mindedly, the fiery liquid catching the light. Slowly, I raised it to my lips, taking a small, deliberate sip before setting it down again. The silence in the room was deafening. I took a measured sip of my bourbon, letting the fiery warmth spread before I responded. For a few moments, I said nothing, letting the weight of the silence hang in the air. Then I spoke, my voice calm but cutting. "Angela, your promises mean absolutely nothing to me anymore," I said. "Let's not pretend otherwise. Everyone in this room knows you're a liar." Her expression faltered, but I didn't stop. "And why," I continued, leaning forward slightly, "should I believe this was your first affair? For all I know, this could just as easily be your 51st. I paused, giving her a moment to let my words sink in before shifting gears. "Angela, think about everything we've built together, all the years, all the sacrifices. We've raised a family. Kelly's married now, and she's even thinking about starting a family of her own. We were finally at a point where we could slow down, plan for a retirement that we've worked so hard for. And yet, here we are." I let out a bitter laugh. "But don't worry," I added sarcastically. "In a few years, I'm sure your little fling with Michael will be nothing more than a distant memory, completely forgotten." Without waiting for a response, I stood and walked toward the den to refill my glass. I didn't bother to ask if either of them wanted another drink, and I was certain my lack of courtesy didn't go unnoticed. When I returned to the living room, they were huddled together on the sofa, whispering in hushed tones. Michael cleared his throat and cautiously spoke up. "Do you mind if I say a few things?" he asked, his tone hesitant but firm. I waved my hand dismissively, replying with a disgusted, "Go ahead." He took a moment to gather his thoughts before launching into what sounded like a prepared speech. "Angela's right," he began, glancing nervously at me. "What we had, it wasn't serious. It was a brief fling. I deeply regret getting involved with a married woman. That's not who I am. It's something I've never done before, and I don't plan to ever do it again." He paused, clearly trying to gauge my reaction, then continued. "That said, Angela is an incredible woman. I can see why you've spent decades together. And while I understand your anger, and even your mention of divorce, I'd advise against making any rash decisions in the heat of the moment. You've built a life together, a history that shouldn't be thrown away so quickly." Then, as if pivoting into legal territory, he added, "Angela did have concerns about your prenuptial agreement. Considering how much time has passed and changes in the legal landscape, it's vulnerable. Honestly, it's unlikely to hold up in court. Without solid proof of infidelity, it's essentially unenforceable." I sat back, swirling the bourbon in my glass as I listened. His words stirred a mix of irritation and disbelief in me. How had Angela let herself become so deluded? When he finally finished, I turned to her, letting out a dry chuckle. "Angela," I said, "I'm genuinely baffled. Out of all the people you could have chosen for advice, you went with this guy. A corporate attorney, fresh out of the bottom quarter of his class at Texas Southern University Law School, a school that consistently ranks among the top 10 worst law schools in the country." Michael stiffened, his face betraying a hint of embarrassment, while Angela's eyes widened in shock. "How did you even know that?" she stammered. I shrugged, taking another sip of my drink. "Knowing your enemy is one of my mottos," I replied simply. Turning my attention back to Angela, I asked, "So, what's your plan now? How do you see this playing out?" She hesitated, clearly weighing her response, before finally speaking. "Michael and we're spending the weekend together," she admitted, her voice quieter than before. "I'm staying at his apartment tonight, and tomorrow we're going to New York City. We've planned to stay there Friday and Saturday night, and then I'll be back home on Sunday." Her words hung in the air like a grenade waiting to detonate. I sat back, my expression unreadable, as I let the reality of her decision sink in. By Sunday, I knew every detail of their plans, yet hearing my wife state them so brazenly still hit me like a punch to the gut. The audacity of it wasn't just angering, it was profoundly sad. I looked at Angela, hoping she could see the depth of my disappointment etched into my expression. "Do you even realize what you're doing?" I asked quietly, my voice tinged with hurt. I reminded her about our long-standing tradition of quarterly getaway weekends to New York City. Those trips had been some of the highlights of our marriage, filled with unforgettable moments. Award-winning Broadway plays, incredible concerts, thrilling sporting events. They weren't just vacations. They were pieces of our shared story. "Do you really think those memories will feel the same now?" I said, my voice breaking slightly. "You've tarnished them. You've tarnished us." Angela shifted uncomfortably, her eyes reflecting the weight of my words. I could tell she sensed my devastation, but I wasn't sure it mattered anymore. The voices in my head were growing louder, urging me to end this charade once and for all. Turning to Michael, who was sitting there looking more anxious by the second, I asked coldly, "What does your wife think of you sleeping with mine?" Angela immediately intervened, her voice sharp. "Stop it, Chris," she snapped. "Michael's a widower. His wife passed away years ago." Even Michael, despite all his faults, seemed uncomfortable with Angela's bluntness. He cringed at her words, which only made me smirk. I couldn't help myself. "Well, isn't that an interesting contrast?" I remarked, my tone dripping with sarcasm. At least Michael had the decency to lose his spouse before moving on. "What's your excuse, Angela?" Michael hesitated but eventually nodded to confirm his widowed status. Without missing a beat, I reached down and grabbed a manila folder from the backpack by my chair. I opened it, skimmed the first page, and began speaking. "Dr. Cynthia Browner, I said evenly. Michael's late wife. She was an emergency department surgeon at Ascension St. John's Hospital in Detroit. Married to Michael. 2 daughters, Katie and Lacey. Both Angela and Michael froze, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock as I continued. After her kids finished school, she resigned and relocated to Hartford to be with her husband. Quite the life she had, I added, closing the folder with deliberate slowness. Despite everything, I couldn't help but find Angela's stunned expression amusing. For a brief moment, the sheer absurdity of the situation made me want to laugh. Angela, however, was less entertained. Her tone was accusatory as she asked, "How do you even know all of this? Did you lie to me?" That was it. I couldn't hold back anymore. I laughed, long and loud, the sound echoing through the tense room. "A cheat and a liar accusing each other of dishonesty," I said, shaking my head. "You couldn't make this stuff up." Michael, apparently deciding he'd had enough, reached out and cupped Angela's hand. My jaw tightened, and I opened my mouth to protest. But the anger inside me suddenly gave way to something else. Apathy. I realized, in that moment, that I just didn't have the energy to care anymore. Michael began speaking, his voice earnest and full of regret. He apologized for his lies, confessed his feelings for Angela, and even had the audacity to talk about wanting a future with her. It was nauseating. There he was, holding my wife's hand, making plans for the life they'd have together as if I were already out of the picture. Angela, after a brief pause, turned to face me. Her hand remained in Michael's as she spoke. "Chris, I promise, I'll cut ties with him. I'll stop this and go back to being the loving wife you deserve." Her words rang hollow, and as I watched her and Michael exchange quiet whispers, it felt like the ground beneath me was crumbling. Everything I thought I knew, everything we'd built together, was dissolving right in front of me. My heart sank lower with every passing second. Finally, I mustered every ounce of strength to finally speak up. "I need both of your attention," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I deserve the chance to lay out my thoughts and feelings amidst all of this." They exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure how to respond to such a direct request. Sensing their hesitation, I pressed the issue further. "All I'm asking for is 30 minutes of your time. That's not too much to ask, is it?" After a few moments of reluctant deliberation, they agreed and settled back into their seats. Taking a deep breath, I moved with practiced efficiency. During the pandemic, I'd become quite adept at setting up Zoom meetings, and those skills were about to come in handy. As the TV screen flickered to life, I greeted the individuals on the call. "Peter, Lou, can you hear me?" Once the introductions were out of the way, I turned to Angela and her companion, delivering the first of several bombshells. On the screen appeared Lou Beard, my newly retained divorce attorney, and Michael Browner, yes, another Michael Browner, a corporate attorney. Angela and her Michael exchanged alarmed glances as I handed the floor over to Lou. Wasting no time, Lou's tone was calm but authoritative. "Mrs. Harrington," he began, addressing Angela with a formality that felt deliberate. "I'm representing Mr. Harrington in your impending divorce. The papers have already been filed, and you'll need to secure legal representation immediately. A deadline has been set, and arrangements have been made for you to be served. Non-compliance will come with consequences." Angela's face drained of color as Lou continued. "Infidelity has been cited as the primary cause for divorce. We've collected substantial evidence from a private investigator documenting your affair with Mr. Browner." He paused briefly, allowing the gravity of his words to sink in. The shock on their faces was unmistakable. As Lou finished his remarks, I reached for a second manila folder and dropped it onto the coffee table with a resounding thud. The sound startled them both, and they visibly flinched. "Inside that folder," I said, my tone cold and detached, "is a copy of the divorce petition along with the private investigator's full report." Michael hesitated before reaching for the folder, while Angela shot a quick glance at the screen, perhaps seeking reassurance. But there was none to be found. I continued, unrelenting. "We'll be insisting on the full enforcement of the prenuptial agreement," I said, It's been reviewed and updated every 2 years for nearly 3 decades. Each time with your notarized signature, Angela. We're confident it will hold up in court. The next revelation hit like a hammer. As of last night, the board of directors at Harrington Brokerage voted to relieve you of all corporate responsibilities. Your association with the firm is officially terminated. Angela's jaw dropped, but I wasn't finished. You'll be required to return your company car, corporate credit cards, and cell phone. All memberships to clubs associated with the company have been canceled. Joint credit cards? Canceled. Joint financial accounts? Frozen. All in accordance with the prenuptial agreement. Lou stepped in to outline the division of assets. We're requesting an 80-20 split in Mr. Harrington's favor, he explained. This includes his sole retention of the house, free and clear, with an expedited eviction process. Mrs. Harrington will have 30 days to remove her personal belongings. There will be no alimony or child support. Additional claims have been outlined, and your attorney can review them in detail. As Lou finished, he turned to me and asked, "Is there anything I've missed?" "You've covered everything," I replied with a nod. "Thank you for your thoroughness." The screen went dark, signaling the end of the call. Angela shot up from the couch, her movements quick and frantic. "Wait!" she exclaimed, her voice filled with desperation. Turning to me, she pleaded, "Chris, please." Angela, her voice trembling with frustration, demanded, "Bring them back. I have questions." I let out a small sigh, keeping my tone calm and firm. "It doesn't work that way, Angela," I said. "If you need answers, you'll have to hire your own attorney." Her frustration boiled over, and she lashed out with a threat. "I'll destroy you, Chris," she snapped, her eyes blazing with anger. Smirking, I turned to her companion and raised an eyebrow. "What's your legal opinion on how this development might affect the divorce?" I asked, my words dripping with sarcasm. Michael didn't respond. He just sat there, his silence deepening Angela's distress. She sank back into the couch, her composure visibly unraveling. Unable to hide my amusement, I smiled broadly and gave the TV remote a little wave before pointing it at the screen. "Let's see what's next, shall we?" I said, pressing a button. The TV flickered back to life, revealing the start of the second Zoom meeting. "Jake, can you hear me?" I asked, addressing the man on the screen. "Yes," he replied, his tone brisk. "But I'll need to keep this brief. I have a conference call coming up." Without wasting a moment, Jake turned his attention to Michael. "Mr. Browner, this is to inform you that your employment is terminated, effective immediately," he stated. "Your personal belongings are being packed and will be left in the lobby. You'll have 24 hours to retrieve them before they're disposed of." Michael's face flushed with embarrassment, but Jake wasn't finished. "There will be no letter of recommendation," he added, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. I glanced at Angela and caught the flicker of fear in her expression. Her boss's voice slowed slightly as he shifted focus to her, and I could see her hands trembling. Jake sighed deeply. "Angela, I'm disappointed in your behavior. As a senior member of my staff, I expected better." He paused, then continued, "That said, I must acknowledge your 29 years of exemplary service. However, your position in Hartford has been eliminated. I'm offering you a similar role at our Albany, New York facility. You have 1 week to decide, and if you accept, 30 days to complete the relocation." The screen went blank, leaving Angela in tears. She buried her face in her hands, while Michael slouched back on the couch, his posture tense and defeated. I leaned back in my chair, smirking at Michael. When he finally noticed, his face turned crimson with rage. He clenched his fists, clearly ready to explode. Younger, bigger, and probably stronger, he might have thought he had the upper hand. Unfortunately for him, he was as sharp as a bag of rocks, and I wasn't done yet. Before he could act on his fury, I waved the remote again, pointing it at the TV. The screen came to life, and I asked, "Dr. Browner, can you hear me?" The reaction was instant. Michael and Angela froze, their faces pale as ghosts. Their mouths hung open as the image of a stunning blonde woman filled the screen. Cynthia Browner, Michael's wife. Her voice was calm but cold. "Michael," she began, her tone cutting through the room like a knife. "I've filed for divorce. You should expect to be served in the next few days." Michael's jaw dropped further as Cynthia continued. "I intend to remain in Michigan with our children," she stated. "I've also managed to retain my position at the hospital." Desperation filled Michael's voice as he pleaded with her. "Cynthia, please, reconsider. We can work this out. It was just a fling. Nothing serious." The look on Cynthia's face spoke volumes. Disgust radiated from her expression. She shook her head slowly, "And you'll see the second part of this story tomorrow on this channel.